Victimization is one of the strangest areas of criminal justice and criminology to talk about for a whole set of reasons. One reason is because we tend to have very mythologized ideas about who is likely to become a victim and why people are likely to become a victim. Another reason we have a difficulty in approaching this subject is that we tend to think the criminal justice system focuses on the victim when it doesn't. A third is that the politics of victimhood has become a really big issue in some senses reshaping the criminal justice system and aspects of the criminal justice system, especially criminal sentencing laws over the last few years. So let's delve a little bit more into the issue of victimization by starting off by asking who becomes a victim. The most important thing we need to know is, statistically speaking, not everybody has an equal chance of becoming a victim of crime. In fact, most of us are very unrealistic about the likelihood of victimization. So if I was a young, tough dude, male dude, that's an important part of it, I'd probably think, I'm not going to become a victim of crime. But actually, young men, particularly young black men, are much more likely to become victims of crime than little old ladies sweetly walking to the supermarket, although the little old ladies might think they are more likely to become victims of crime. Now, in part, this depends on kinds of crime. If we're talking about being conned out of money, then that old lady will probably have more of a chance of being conned out of money. If it's somebody who is going to be a target of cybercrime, they are going to be in the demographic that has to use computers. So those kind of issues all come into play. And that word demographic is really, really important, because demography, or issues like one's age, one's sex, one's race, one's whether you live in a rural or urban area, all make a very big difference in terms of us being more or less likely to become victims. And by the way, this is not just true in the United States, it's true the world over. There are certain things that greatly increase the likelihood of being a victim of crime, like being in an urban area or being poor. The wealthier you are, the more chance you have of protecting yourself from crime. Firstly, your government is much more likely to be concerned about protecting you if you're wealthy. Sad reality, but true. The second thing is you're much more likely to be able to buy private protection from crime, like a security service and so on. And of course, then there are other factors that really do depend on particular environments. For example, gun crime in the United States is much higher because, guess what? We have a lot more guns than comparable countries. But myths abound in terms of victimization. One is that we tend to think of most crime as interracial, between two races or between two ethnic groups, but actually most crime is intraracial, I-N-T-R-A, as opposed to I-N-T-E-R. Whether we are going to be victimized by a stranger or by an acquaintance depends a lot on the kind of crime. For example, sexual assault is much more likely to be by someone we know. Think date rape, think incest in a family context, than if we are a victim of a property crime where it's much more likely we are going to be victimized by a stranger. But overall, the idea that strangers are our greatest threat when it comes to being a victim of crime is very often just wrong. So in many ways, it means we're teaching our kids the wrong things in terms of how they can protect themselves from crime. Later on in this class, you're going to learn more about the court system, about the adversarial process, and you're going to see some videos about lawyers, both criminal defense lawyers and prosecutors, who, among other things, are going to talk about victims. Particularly the prosecutor is going to talk about how everything he does is designed to protect the victim. Now, I'm sure that particular prosecutor, as most prosecutors who talk about protecting the victim, is not lying. They see their work as protecting the victim. But here's the really important issue. The criminal justice system is not and was never designed to be oriented towards the victim. The criminal justice system is designed to get to the truth in terms of the adversarial process and to protect the rights of the defendant. So where does that leave the victim? Well, that was a very big question that was asked politically and socially, particularly from the 1970s and 1980s onwards, when victims' rights movements arose and said, hang on, it's not fair that we're so concerned about the rights of the suspect and the defendant. What about the victims? And certainly those victims' rights movements have done a lot to put the victim closer to the center of the focus of what the criminal justice system can do. But here's the problem. Structurally, the reality of the adversarial system where the state has to prove a case against a defendant means that the focus is never going to primarily be on the victim unless we have a whole different system. So we have found more and more ways to integrate the victim into the system, at least in an ideal world. Everything from allowing victim testimony in the consideration of sentencing to victim advocates or victim supporters that are provided by the criminal justice system. There are many reforms we've made. But the fundamentals of the system is that the system is not designed around the victim. The state is the victim. Society is the victim in that philosophical, legal, and ideological sense. Another paradox is that although one of the things many victims say they want most from a criminal perpetrator is some sort of apology. But again, our adversarial system makes it a very bad idea in many ways for people who have committed crimes to acknowledge their wrongdoing until very far into the process. In contrast, some other ideas of responding to crime and ways of punishing, like restorative justice that we'll talk more about when we talk about punishment, put more focus on the victim. So we see those important paradoxes. What I think we are all somewhat aware of but need to be more aware of is the effects of victimization. So when we're looking at victimization, costs are a really important factor and they're very hard to compute. There's some things that are relatively easy to compute, like what was the cost of the bicycle or the phone that was stolen. But other things are far more difficult to compute. What was the cost to shareholders in a case of insider trading? What was the cost to lowered property values from street crime? Then, beyond the things we can actually count relatively easily in terms of property, we have to look at other kinds of costs. How does fear affect the way people interact in a community? Do people stop going to restaurants or bars in the evenings because they're scared to leave their houses? What about social costs like declining trust because of victimization? What about political costs where politicians can successfully use fear of crime and fear of being a victim of crime to get political support, but that could drive irrational policies that are hugely expensive to the taxpayer? Do we count those as costs of victimization, or are those just distant byproducts of victimization? What we see when we look at victimization is we need to look at both individual versus community areas. And we also need to recognize that we're not just talking about the individuals who are directly affected by crime as victim or perpetrator, or those who are investigating the crime or prosecuting the crime, but more broadly, every taxpayer who knows that their money is being used to subsidize and create a criminal justice system. Every voter who is voting for a representative is going to make laws protecting victims or protecting defendants' rights or reducing defendants' rights, or making victim advocates available. These are critical issues, whether we're talking about the costs of prison or the costs of medical care for somebody who's been victimized. One of the most controversial issues in victimization and victimology is the acknowledgement, which we know from a factual and research basis, that victims can and may play a role in their victimization. That's a very important insight. Small example. If you leave something of value open in your car, even if your car is locked, the chance of your car being broken into for that item of value to be stolen is going to increase. Now, in that kind of example, we're perhaps more accepting of the idea we need to speak about these ideas. But what about the idea of don't walk in this or that area because it's not safe? If it's a case of a woman, would the person who makes that claim be accused of being a sexist or blaming the victim? The reality is that although we know victims can and may play a role in their victimization, and we can and should use that to decrease victimization, we must realize that knowing that fact is not the same as blaming the victim. In other words, even if I get something stolen out of my car because I left it in sight, doesn't make me anything less of a victim and doesn't make the perpetrator anything less of a criminal. They still have criminal responsibility, and I've still had something taken from me illegally. Having said that, the whole society would be much better off if that opportunity was harder for the perpetrator to take advantage of. And that's what lies at the heart of preventing victimization. How can we decrease the opportunities for perpetrators, and how can we increase opportunities for law-abiding people not to become victims? In some ways, this goes back to some of the ideas we talked about in terms of myths of victimization. If we stop teaching children that their biggest fear lies in strangers and start teaching children that if a teacher or a religious leader or a coach could hurt them and they still need to tell a grown-up, we will ultimately become much more effective in decreasing the possibility of child sexual assault and increasing the protection of the victims, who sometimes take years or decades to be able to talk about their stories.